That night, the city glowed with its usual indifferent brilliance, the lights of Manhattan shimmering against the dark water like a million small confessions that no one would ever make aloud. And as the taxi carried me home through the veins of New York, I felt the hum of the world outside pressing gently against the silence that lived inside me. The driver's radio whispered some late-night jazz, the kind that sounds as though it remembers heartbreak, and I sat in the back seat with my hands resting on my worn canvas bag, still feeling the heat of the evening on my skin. The dinner was over, the confrontation, the unveiling, the truth laid bare like an open wound on a white tablecloth. And yet the echoes of every word spoken seemed to follow me, lingering in the corners of my mind as the taxi moved through the avenues. I remembered the look in Ethan's eyes, my son's eyes, when he realized who I truly was. The confusion, the pride, the guilt, all tangled together like threads pulled too tight. I had gone to that dinner pretending to be someone else, a modest woman with a simple life, to test the hearts of those who claimed to love him. And though I had succeeded in my plan, victory had never felt so heavy. The driver, an older man with gray at his temples and hands that spoke of work, watched me through the mirror. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked softly, and his voice carried the easy patience of someone who had learned that strangers sometimes need a listener more than advice. I hesitated, then nodded. "Everything's fine," I said, though the words felt fragile, like glass balancing on the edge of truth. He smiled faintly and turned back to the road. "You came out of that place real quiet," he said after a pause. "People usually leave that restaurant laughing, talking about the wine. You look like you've just come from a battlefield." I couldn't help a small smile. "Something like that," I replied. "A war of manners, maybe." He chuckled under his breath. "Those are the worst kind," he said. "No medals, no bandages, just scars you can't see." His words surprised me with their accuracy, and for a moment I thought of how rare it was to meet simple wisdom in unexpected places. "You're perceptive," I told him. "Part of the job," he said, and the way he said it made me think he meant more than just driving a cab. Outside the window, the city pulsed with its restless energy. Neon lights flickered against puddles left by a recent drizzle, and the reflection of passing cars painted moving galaxies across the wet asphalt. I leaned my head against the cool glass and thought of what had unfolded only hours before. Veronica and Frederick, Simone's parents, though in my story now they bore the polished edges of New York wealth, had revealed themselves with every cruel smile, every condescending glance. They had treated me, the woman they thought poor and beneath them, like a curiosity to be pitied or dismissed. I had let them, at first. I had wanted to see their truth unguarded, and when the moment came, when I lifted the mask and told them who I really was, Clara Evans, not a struggling retiree but the founder of the very company their son-in-law admired, they had crumbled, their arrogance collapsing into shock. Yet the satisfaction of that unveiling had faded quickly, leaving behind only a hollow ache, triumph without joy, justice without peace. The taxi slowed at a red light. "Can I ask you something personal?" the driver said. I turned my gaze to him, curious. "Go ahead." He studied me through the mirror. "Are you rich?" The bluntness of the question startled me, but there was no malice in it, only honest curiosity. I laughed softly. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Because you paid me with crisp new bills, but carry a bag that's seen better years. You dress like comfort matters more than fashion, but you talk like someone used to being heard." I smiled at his observation. "It depends on how you define rich," I said. "If you mean money, then yes, I have more than enough. But if you mean peace, purpose, love, then I suppose I'm richer still." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That's the kind of wealth that doesn't get taxed," he said, and when the light turned green, He drove on. By the time we reached my building, the streets had thinned to a hush. The old brownstone stood quietly among others like it, modest but dignified, its bricks the color of history. I paid the fare and handed him a generous tip. "You listened," I told him. "That's worth more than money." He looked at the bill, then back at me. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "And ma'am, whatever happened tonight, don't regret it." People who tell the truth, even when it hurts, make the world a little better. His words landed gently, like a blessing. I nodded. "Thank you. I'll remember that." As he drove away, I stood for a moment on the quiet street, the hum of the engine fading into the distance, and looked up at my fifth-floor window, dark, silent, waiting. Inside, the apartment greeted me with its familiar stillness. The air smelled faintly of old books and lavender. The furniture was simple, worn smooth by years of use. Nothing matched perfectly, but everything belonged. I turned on the light and slipped off my shoes, feeling the cool wooden floor beneath my feet. There was comfort in this small, imperfect space, a kind of honesty that the gilded halls of people like Veronica and Frederick could never offer. I made tea, the steam curling like a ghost of warmth through the room, and sat by the window. The city stretched below me, alive and endless. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me unclench, freedom, perhaps, or the quiet relief of no longer pretending. I had spent too long fitting myself into other people's expectations, dimming my truth to make others comfortable. But tonight, I had spoken it, loudly, clearly, irrevocably, and though it had cost me a piece of peace, it had given me something far greater, myself. My phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Mom, did you get home safe?" I smiled and typed back, "Yes, sweetheart. I'm home and resting." His reply came almost instantly. "I love you. Thank you for everything, for being who you are, for teaching me, for never giving up." A tear slipped down my cheek, not from sorrow, but from gratitude, from the simple miracle of being understood. "I love you too," I wrote. Then I set the phone aside and let the silence settle again. The clock ticked softly. My tea grew cold. And in that quiet, I realized that wealth, real wealth, was this: the peace of knowing you had lived truthfully, the serenity that comes when your heart no longer owes anyone an explanation. Morning found me before dawn. Years of work had trained my body to rise with the light, even when there was no reason to. I brewed strong black coffee and sat by the window, watching the city yawn awake. Vendors rolled up their shutters, buses sighed at corners, and the sky turned from gray to the softest pink. Life, indifferent and beautiful, moved on. My phone rang again, Ethan's number glowing on the screen. "Good morning, Mom," he said when I answered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I need to talk to you." "Did something happen?" I asked. "A lot," he said. "Last night Simone and I talked for hours. Her parents were there too. It was intense. I could hear the fatigue beneath his words, the weight of decisions newly made. "Tell me," I said, and took a slow sip of coffee. He spoke quietly, haltingly at first, then with growing conviction. After I had left, Veronica and Frederick had stayed behind at the restaurant, their credit cards failing one after another. A small but poetic justice. Simone had cried. He had raged. And in that moment, he said, something inside him broke loose. He told them everything. How ashamed he'd felt. How he couldn't bear the way they'd treated me. How money had become their god. They'd tried to defend themselves, of course. Pride rarely surrenders easily. But when Simone herself spoke, defending me and denouncing their cruelty, the air in that gilded room had changed. "Mom," he said. I'd never seen her stand up to them before. She told them she was ashamed. I felt a quiet warmth bloom in my chest. "That's good," I said softly. It means she's beginning to see. He told me then how Veronica had screamed, how Frederick had accused me of manipulation, how he had told them they were right, that I had indeed planned it, but that their reactions had proven everything I wanted to show. I couldn't help but laugh, low and dry. "Well done," I murmured. "You've learned well." He fell silent for a moment, then said, "Mom, I made a decision. Simone and I are setting boundaries. No more comments about money, no more comparisons, no control. If they can't respect that, they'll have to live with the distance." I listened, proud and quiet. "Did they accept it?" I asked. "Of course not," he said, almost amused. "They called us ungrateful, said we'd regret it, threatened to cut us off." I smiled into my coffee. Emotional blackmail, the final weapon of those who've already lost. He laughed weakly. "Exactly." But it didn't work. We left that restaurant lighter than we'd been in years. His voice softened. "Mom, thank you. I know last night wasn't easy, but we needed to see them for who they were. And Simone needed to see another way to live. Your way." I told him there was nothing to thank me for, that I had only done what conscience demanded. But deep inside, I felt something stirring, a quiet pride that my son had finally learned to walk by principle rather than habit. "Simone wants to see you," he went on, his voice cautious but hopeful. "She wants to apologize, not out of guilt, but because she understands now. She says she wants to talk to you woman to woman." I looked out the window where morning light shimmered on the roofs like small seas of gold. "Tell her she can," I said, "but not today. She needs time to think, to mean what she says. Quick apologies are like quick rain. They make everything damp and nothing grow." He laughed softly and promised he would tell her. Before hanging up, he asked, "How are you feeling after all this?" And I told him the truth. "At peace, Ethan. Truly at peace. When you speak what's been sitting in your chest for years, even pain feels clean." He sighed, a sound half relief, half wonder, and whispered, "I love you." "I love you too, my son," I said, and when the line went silent, I realized the day ahead was mine again. I dressed simply, jeans and an old cardigan, and decided to walk with no destination. The city was waking in full color now, sunlight slicing between buildings, early vendors shouting their optimism into the streets. Children clutched breakfast sandwiches, cab doors slammed, a dog barked at nothing in particular, and everything smelled of coffee and rain on concrete. I walked until my thoughts grew softer, until the rhythm of my steps replaced the noise in my head. In a small park near the river, I found an empty bench and sat down. Around me, people moved with the serene urgency of ordinary life, a couple arguing gently about groceries, a young man feeding pigeons, an elderly woman knitting while watching the sky. And it struck me that most of them probably lived on modest means, yet carried a peace that wealth could never purchase. They smiled, they touched, they existed without performance. I thought of Veronica and Frederick, now Victoria and Francis in my American life, surrounded by opulence but starved of joy, always measuring, always competing, as if afraid that stillness would reveal the hollowness inside. I wondered if they had ever watched the city simply breathe like this, without the need to own a piece of it. A voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" An elderly woman had settled beside me, her thin hands breaking a roll of bread into pieces for the pigeons. "It is," I said. "Perfect, really." She smiled with eyes the color of faded denim. "I come here every Sunday," she said. "It keeps me sane." We talked in that easy way that strangers sometimes do when the soul recognizes a kindred rhythm. When she learned my name, she laughed softly. "Clara," she said. A clear name for a woman who looks like she's just cleared something heavy from her heart. I smiled, surprised at her perception. "Something like that," I admitted. Sometimes a single night can rearrange everything. She nodded knowingly. I've lived long enough to see that. One dinner, one decision, and suddenly the rest of your life looks different. She gestured toward the pigeons. Look at them. None of them richer than the other, yet none go hungry. Humans could learn a thing or two about sharing bread instead of measuring crumbs. I laughed. That's a lesson some people I know could use. Oh, child, she said, people will always chase illusions of superiority. But the ground evens us all in the end. With or without diamonds, we become dust the same way. Her voice carried neither bitterness nor fear, only a calm acceptance carved by time. I listened, and something within me relaxed. You're wise, I said. No, just old, she answered, feeding another piece of bread to a brave pigeon that had perched on her shoe. The richest people I ever met were the ones who had the least to prove. The miserable ones were always counting. Money, trophies, wrinkles. They never realized they'd already lost count of the moments that mattered. Her words settled deep inside me like gentle stones dropped into still water. I thanked her sincerely. She patted my hand. Remember this, she said. All that remains after we're gone is how we made others feel. That's the only inheritance that lasts. Then she stood, brushed crumbs from her skirt, and walked away with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned what time really meant. I watched her until she vanished into the crowd, feeling as if life itself had just leaned close to whisper a truth I'd been circling for years. I sat there a while longer, watching the pigeons swirl and the morning stretch into afternoon. The city roared gently around me, an orchestra of life continuing without permission. For the first time since the dinner, I felt no anger toward Victoria or Francis, only distance, a clean, necessary distance. I understood now that not everyone was meant to understand you. Some were meant to teach you the value of boundaries. The breeze shifted, carrying the smell of warm pretzels and distant sea air, and I smiled because peace had texture again. When I finally rose from the bench and walked home, I felt lighter, as though the ground itself had forgiven me for the weight I'd carried. 3 days passed quietly. I worked from home, answered emails, took calls, cooked small meals for myself, and let silence become a friend instead of a punishment. Then, one late afternoon, the bell rang. I knew before opening the door who it was. Simone, no, in this retelling, Sophie, stood there with her hair tied back, no makeup, no armor. She wore jeans and a plain white blouse, her hands twisting nervously around a set of keys. Mrs. Evans, she said softly, may I come in? Of course, I answered, stepping aside. She walked slowly into my apartment, her eyes scanning the space with something like wonder. There was no designer furniture here, no art to impress, only the quiet evidence of a life lived deliberately. She sat on the edge of the sofa while I took the chair across from her, letting the air fill with unspoken things until she was ready. I don't know where to begin, she said finally. Wherever it feels right, I told her. She took a deep breath and began to talk, halting at first, then with gathering courage. She told me about her parents' past, about how they had clawed their way out of poverty, how they had learned to equate wealth with safety and control. Their obsession with status was not born of greed, she said, but of terror of returning to hunger, of being powerless again. I listened quietly, hearing in her voice not excuses, but understanding. Trauma makes strange monuments, I said, but it never justifies cruelty. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know. I stayed silent all these years because they taught me that disagreeing was betrayal. But that night, when you spoke, something cracked. I realized love isn't obedience, and money isn't respect. I saw what real strength looks like. She paused, wiping her face with the back of her hand. You showed me another kind of wealth, the kind that doesn't scream to be seen. I told her I hadn't come to that dinner to change her, only to protect myself. She smiled faintly. Maybe, but you changed me anyway. You saved me from becoming them. I looked at her, this young woman who only days ago had stood silent while her parents belittled me, and I felt no resentment, only a quiet compassion. Then don't waste the lesson, I said. Use it to build differently. She nodded. Ethan and I have set boundaries. They're furious. Say we've betrayed them, that we'll regret it. But for the first time, I don't feel guilty. I feel free. I reached across the space between us and touched her hand. That feeling is the beginning of adulthood, I said. Keep it safe. She looked at me with those earnest eyes and whispered, Teach me. Teach me how to live like you do, with dignity, with peace, without needing to prove anything. I smiled. You already know how. You just have to stop asking permission to be yourself. She laughed through her tears. I'll try. Not all at once, I told her. Start small. Before you buy, before you speak, ask, does this bring me peace or just appearance? She repeated the words softly, as if committing them to memory. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. Do you think they'll ever change? I thought for a moment, choosing honesty over comfort. Maybe not. Change requires seeing a problem, and they believe the world is wrong, not them. But you can change. You can break the pattern. She nodded, resolute. I will. And when we have children, I'll teach them what you taught me, that people's worth isn't measured in what they own. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, the kind that feels like forgiveness. We hugged then, two women shedding the last of their masks, and when she left an hour later, the apartment seemed brighter for it. I stood by the window as evening fell, watching the sun stain the skyline in shades of amber and rose. My phone buzzed again, a message from Ethan. Mom, Sophie told me about your talk. Thank you for giving her a chance. I love you more than words. I typed back simply, I love you too, always. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, tiny testaments to persistence. And as I watched them, I understood something that wealth, age, and even pain had all tried to teach me. Real riches are measured not in what we acquire, but in what we are able to let go of. Fear, pride, pretense. Victoria and Francis would go on counting their assets. I would go on counting my blessings. And between those two ledgers lay the difference between surviving and living. When the message faded from the screen, I placed the phone face down and simply sat in the half-light, letting the room breathe with me. The radiator ticked softly, a faint metallic heartbeat in the quiet, and somewhere outside a saxophone wandered up from the street like a prayer that had forgotten its words. I thought about the strange symmetry of life, how a single confrontation over dinner had unfolded into a chain of reckonings, how the truth, once spoken aloud, refused to crawl back into silence. My small apartment felt almost holy now, its imperfections turned sacred by the peace that filled them. The mismatched chairs, the scuffed wooden floor, the chipped mug on the table, all of it told the story of a woman who had survived not by pretending to be more, but by learning to be enough. The following morning, I woke early, before the city had properly found its rhythm. The skyline outside my window glowed faintly, and the air carried that curious stillness that belongs to the hour between dreams and obligations. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the ghosts of my old ambitions and watched steam curl upward like small, unspoken prayers. Habit pulled me toward my window seat, where I could see the corner bakery opening, the florist dragging buckets of roses to the curb, the first commuters trudging through puddles left by last night's drizzle. The world was beginning again, as it always did, and I felt ready to meet it, not armored, not disguised, but open. Later, I decided to step outside, to walk without plan. I passed the deli, where the owner always nodded to me without knowing my name, the record store that still smelled of cardboard and vinyl dreams, the church steps where pigeons gathered like gossipers. I stopped at a street vendor for a pretzel, its salt stinging pleasantly on my tongue, and realized how extraordinary ordinary moments could be when you no longer measured them against anything grander. At the park near the Hudson, children shouted through the cold wind, their laughter ricocheting off the water. I sat on a bench, wrapped my hands around a paper cup of coffee, and let the river's rhythm match my breath. Across from me, a young couple argued softly about rent, about groceries, about all the tiny logistics that keep love real. They didn't see me watching, but I smiled anyway. There was something beautiful in their struggle. It meant they were building, trying, living. My mind drifted back to Sophie and Ethan, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine them building a gentler future, one where love wasn't traded like currency, where apology didn't taste like defeat. I thought of Sophie's trembling voice when she said she wanted to learn, and of the strange maternal ache that had filled me then, a mixture of pity and pride. Perhaps every generation needed to stumble before it learned to stand on truth. I had stumbled plenty. I remembered my own youth when I chased titles, apartments, a version of success that glittered like a mirage. Back then, I measured my worth by how exhausted I was, how many people needed me, how polished I appeared in rooms that never truly saw me. I learned, painfully, that achievement without authenticity is just another disguise. The wind grew colder, carrying a taste of the sea. I zipped my jacket and began the long walk home, the city's pulse humming beneath my feet. On the way, I passed a small bookstore I hadn't noticed in years. Inside, dust floated like gold in the light. The owner, an older man with kind eyes, greeted me as if I were an old friend. I browsed until a worn copy of Letters to a Young Poet caught my attention. I bought it, not because I needed another book, but because something in me longed to hear Rilke's quiet counsel again, to be reminded that solitude is not emptiness, but space to grow. Back at home, I placed the book on my bedside table. My life no longer required grand gestures. Small rituals were enough. That night, as rain began to whisper against the windows, I cooked pasta with olive oil and garlic, poured a modest glass of wine, and toasted silently to the strange mercy of beginnings that disguise themselves as endings. The city outside glowed like a living map of possibilities, and somewhere among those countless windows, people were learning, failing, forgiving, just as I was. I felt connected to them, not by wealth or status, but by the simple fact of trying to do better. And for the first time in a long time, I believed I was exactly where I was meant to be. The next few days passed with the rhythm of quiet contentment, the kind that feels almost suspicious after years of turbulence, as though happiness itself were tiptoeing around, afraid to be noticed. I filled the hours with small, grounding rituals, watering the plants that refused to die, sorting old letters into keep or let go piles, dusting the shelves that held my mismatched souvenirs from a life of effort. Every object seemed to speak: a chipped cup from my first job in Brooklyn, a photograph from an office party long dissolved, a seashell picked up years ago on a Coney Island afternoon when laughter had come easily. These tiny witnesses to endurance surrounded me like gentle proof that I had survived more than I ever boasted about. One evening, while the sun lowered itself lazily behind the skyline, Ethan called again just to say he and Sophie had spent the day painting their small apartment. He sounded lighter, freer. They had argued about the color. He wanted navy, she wanted cream, and had ended up with something in between, a stormy blue that somehow suited them both. I could hear Sophie laughing in the background, that genuine kind of laughter that makes you believe in repair. "Mom," Ethan said, "I think we're okay. I think we're really going to be okay." I told him that love isn't about avoiding storms. It's about learning which ones are worth standing in together. After the call, I sat by the window, watching the neon reflections ripple across the wet asphalt. I thought of Victoria and Francis again, not with resentment, but with an odd kind of pity. They had chosen to remain prisoners of their own expectations, measuring each day's worth in dollars and dominance. They would likely never know the sweetness of an honest apology or the fragile beauty of humility. And though a small part of me mourned that, another part finally understood that some stories are not mine to rewrite. My task had never been to fix anyone else. It had been to free myself. The realization unfurled slowly, like dawn spreading across a cityscape. For years, I had mistaken endurance for strength, silence for grace, patience for love. I had thought being the bigger person meant carrying other people's shadows until my own light dimmed. Now I knew that true strength sometimes means setting the burden down and walking away. I no longer needed anyone's permission to rest. I no longer needed to prove that kindness could survive cruelty. It already had. I was living proof. The following weekend, I decided to visit the farmers' market downtown, a small rebellion against the isolation I had once called comfort. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon, and the chatter of vendors braided with laughter and music. I bought too many apples, chatted with a young barista about the weather, let a child convince me to try a sample of honey that tasted like sunlight. For the first time in months, I caught myself humming under my breath. On the way home, I passed a mirror in a shop window and barely recognized the woman reflected there. Older, yes, with lines that told on her kindness, but lighter somehow, as though forgiveness had trimmed away years of heaviness. That evening, I lit a candle and wrote in a notebook I hadn't touched in years. The words came out simple and steady. Peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of understanding. Beneath it, I added, I am done shrinking to fit other people's comfort. Then I closed the book and felt as though I had signed a quiet treaty with myself. The flame danced beside me, and I thought of how fire can destroy or illuminate, depending on what you feed it. I chose illumination. Days blended into a gentle routine: work, walks, reading, the occasional dinner with an old friend. Life was not dramatic anymore, but it was real. One crisp morning, Sophie stopped by unexpectedly with a basket of muffins and a shy smile. I baked too many, she said, though the flour on her cheek betrayed that she had planned the visit. We sat together drinking coffee, speaking about everything and nothing, her job, Ethan's new project, the neighbor's dog. Then she said, we finally visited my parents. It was strange. They were polite but distant. My mother asked about you. I raised an eyebrow. And what did you tell her? Sophie smiled faintly. That you're doing well, that you're the kind of woman who sleeps peacefully at night. She didn't know how to respond, I chuckled, imagining Victoria trying to process the concept of peace as success. Maybe she'll think about it, I said. Maybe, Sophie replied, but even if she doesn't, I will. When she left, the apartment smelled of cinnamon and closure. I realized that the distance between the woman I had been and the one I was becoming could be measured in breaths, not miles. All I had done was tell the truth, and in doing so, I had redrawn the borders of my life. Sometimes liberation doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it slips in quietly through the front door, disguised as ordinary peace. I sat by the window again as evening descended, the city glowing like embers. Somewhere below, someone played a trumpet, the notes rising slow and smoky through the air. I thought about the long road that had led me here, the dinners, the confrontations, the years of compromise, and felt an immense gratitude that it had all happened exactly as it did. Without the cruelty, I might never have learned compassion's boundaries. Without humiliation, I might never have understood dignity. Without loss, I might never have recognized freedom. The skyline shimmered, each light a tiny affirmation of survival, and I whispered to the glass, "Thank you." The thank you was not to anyone in particular, more to life itself for having the patience to wait while I learned its lessons. I thought of how every heartache, every humiliation had been an instructor in disguise, of how loneliness had trained me to recognize genuine connection when it appeared. The candle flickered on the sill, its small flame steady against the draft, and I realized that this was what healing looked like, not the sudden disappearance of pain, but the gradual softening of its edges. I brewed another cup of tea and curled into the corner of the couch, listening to the steady percussion of rain against the window. Each drop seemed to echo some memory I had once tried to forget. The long nights at the office when ambition had tasted like iron in my mouth. The birthdays I had spent pretending laughter could drown silence. The countless dinners where I had smiled through condescension so my son would not see the bruise forming on my spirit. All of it had brought me here, to this quiet apartment filled with the hum of appliances and the fragrance of chamomile, and somehow that seemed like victory. The next morning the rain had washed the city clean. Streets gleamed, leaves clung wetly to car windshields, and the air smelled of iron and beginnings. I walked to the corner cafe for breakfast, the same one I used to hurry past when time was something I owed other people. The barista recognized me now. She greeted me by name, and that small gesture of familiarity warmed me more than the coffee ever could. I sat near the window watching pedestrians hurry by, their umbrellas blossoming and closing like cautious flowers. New York had a strange beauty in its indifference. It allowed you to be whoever you were without apology. Perhaps that was why I had chosen to stay all these years. The city did not ask for performance. It demanded presence. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the community center where I occasionally volunteered. The director, a cheerful woman named Denise, greeted me with her usual exuberance. "Clara, we could use your calm energy today," she said, gesturing toward a group of teenagers sorting donations. I spent the next few hours helping them organize boxes, teaching them how to fold clothes efficiently, listening to their chatter about college and music and dreams. One girl, maybe 16, asked, "Do you ever get scared that you wasted time?" I smiled, recognizing in her question the anxiety that had haunted my younger self. "Time spent learning who you are is never wasted," I told her. "It just takes longer than anyone warns you." She nodded as if she understood, and I hoped she would remember that sentence someday when the world tried to convince her otherwise. When I finally returned home, dusk had already settled like velvet over the city. I cooked a simple dinner, roasted vegetables, rice, a drizzle of lemon, and ate slowly, mindful of each bite. My phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Sophie says hi. We're thinking of coming over Sunday for brunch, if that's okay." I typed back, "Of course, bring your appetites." The thought of their visit filled me with a calm excitement. Hosting had once been an exercise in performance. Now it felt like an act of love. I spent Saturday morning preparing. Nothing elaborate, just fresh fruit, homemade pancakes, and coffee strong enough to wake the truth itself. When they arrived, Sophie carried flowers, Ethan carried a grin, and the apartment filled with the easy noise of family. We ate, we talked, we laughed about old stories that no longer hurt. At one point, Sophie looked around my modest living room and said, "You know, everything here feels honest." I laughed. "That's the nicest compliment you could give." She nodded thoughtfully. "It's like every object belongs because it has a purpose, not because it was meant to impress." "Exactly," I said. "Things should serve you, not define you." Ethan squeezed her hand, pride flickering in his eyes. After brunch, we walked along the river, the three of us moving in comfortable silence. The water shimmered beneath the bridge, and gulls circled lazily overhead. Sophie turned to me and said, "Thank you for giving me another chance." I answered, "You gave it to yourself." She smiled, and the moment felt sealed, an unspoken agreement that the past would remain a teacher, not a chain. That night, after they left, I sat by the window again. The city stretched beneath me like a constellation of unkept promises. Somewhere below, a siren wailed, then faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the subway. I felt the pulse of New York beating through me, restless, alive, forgiving. I realized that this city had always mirrored my own story. Loud, scarred, endlessly rebuilding itself. I whispered to it, half laughing, "We're not so different, you and I." The reflection that looked back at me from the glass was older than the one I remembered, but softer too, no longer bracing against the world. I thought of the girl I had been when I first arrived here, clutching dreams like fragile glass, terrified they would shatter. She would never have believed that peace could be found not in achievement, but in acceptance. Yet here it was, sitting quietly beside me, asking for nothing but recognition. I sat there for a long time, watching my reflection fade as the city lights brightened behind it, until the glass held both of us, the woman I had been and the one I had become, superimposed like a confession, and its forgiveness sharing the same frame. The hum of the city rose and fell, blending taxis, footsteps, laughter, and the low drone of distant music into a lullaby that belonged to no one and everyone. I thought of how strange it was that life rarely grants closure in grand gestures. It offers it instead in the ordinary act of sitting still and realizing you no longer ache. I made myself another cup of tea, and as the steam rose, I remembered the many nights when this simple ritual had felt like defiance, a way of saying I am still here, I am still trying. Now it was less defiance than gratitude. When I finally went to bed, sleep came easily, not as an escape, but as a companion. I dreamed of water, of a river flowing backward and forward at once, of bridges that led to light rather than away from it. And when I woke, the dream's calm lingered like a scent. The next morning was bright, almost theatrical in its clarity. I opened the window to let in the crisp air, and a flock of pigeons darted across the sky, their wings catching the sun in flashes of silver. I found myself thinking of the old woman in the park, her gentle wisdom about how pigeons share bread without measuring crumbs. And I smiled. She was right. The world's hierarchy existed only in our own frightened minds. As I brewed coffee, I decided to start writing again. Not for publication, not for praise, but to give shape to the thoughts that kept blooming now that I had space for them. I sat at my desk, fingers hovering above the keyboard, and began to type what would become a collection of reflections, half diary, half letter to my younger self. I wrote about the dinner, about truth and consequence, about how courage sometimes looks like quiet refusal. The words poured out without hesitation, as if they had been waiting behind a locked door I had finally opened. I wrote until my wrists ached, until the light shifted from morning gold to afternoon honey. When I stopped, the room was filled with the soft clicking of the cooling radiator and the faint aroma of ink and paper. For the first time in years, I felt both exhausted and renewed, a paradox I welcomed. That evening, Ethan called again. His voice held that buoyant energy of a man who had begun to understand his own boundaries. He told me about a promotion he had been offered, about how Sophie had started volunteering at a literacy program. As he spoke, I realized that healing is contagious. When one person breaks free, it creates space for others to breathe too. "We're planning to visit next weekend," he said. "Sophie wants to cook for you this time." I laughed. "Then I'll try not to hover in the kitchen." "You can hover," he teased, "but only if you let us clean up afterward." When we hung up, I felt that rarest kind of happiness, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your children will carry the lessons you never had words for. Later, I stepped out onto the fire escape, a habit from my younger days that I had revived lately. The metal was cool beneath my palms. The night wind smelled faintly of rain and subway smoke. Below, a group of neighbors were talking and laughing, the sound floating upward like a melody made of belonging. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let it all wash over me, the hum of traffic, the flicker of a distant billboard, the endless heartbeat of the city. I thought of how long I had chased perfection, only to find peace hiding in imperfection's shadow. Maybe that was life's greatest irony. We spend years building armor, only to realize the world begins to love us once we set it down. I stayed there until my coffee grew cold, tracing constellations in the scatter of windows across the skyline. Each light, I decided, was a story, some of joy, some of heartbreak, all of survival. Somewhere out there, Victoria and Francis were probably hosting another glittering dinner, their laughter echoing through rooms too large for intimacy. And I, in my small apartment, with my chipped mugs and my faithful plants, felt richer than I ever had at their tables. Wealth, I understood now, is not the magnitude of what you possess, but the absence of what you need to pretend. I whispered the words into the night, as if offering them to the stars. I have enough. The city, in its indifferent mercy, seemed to agree. The next week unfolded like a gentle rehearsal for a life I had almost forgotten I wanted. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and sunlight sneaking through the curtains. Afternoons dissolved into quiet work and slow walks, and evenings carried the familiar hum of the city settling into itself. One night, I caught sight of my reflection in a shop window and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her shoulders no longer tensed as if bracing for impact, her gaze steady, her mouth curved in a peace that felt earned. I realized that forgiveness, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive as thunder. It seeps in like light under a closed door, and once it's inside, it changes everything it touches. Saturday arrived crisp and blue. Ethan and Sophie came over as promised, bringing laughter and the smell of roasted peppers from whatever dish she had been experimenting with. We cooked together, bumping into one another in the tiny kitchen, spilling olive oil, sharing jokes that didn't need explanation. At the table, conversation wandered easily, from their plans to travel, to the latest book I had fallen in love with, to the small absurdities of city life. Between bites, I studied them, this young couple who had once seemed caught between two worlds, and I marveled at how love can mature quietly when given space to breathe. There was no tension now, only the warmth that grows in the aftermath of truth. When they left that evening, Sophie hugged me tightly and whispered, "You were right. Peace is addictive." I smiled and told her, "Then never quit the habit." After they were gone, I tidied the kitchen, humming to myself, and when I switched off the lights, the apartment glowed faintly in the spill of the street lamps. I sat by the window again, the same window that had witnessed my anger, my grief, my awakening, and watched a drizzle begin to fall. The drops streaked down the glass like slow tears, though mine had long since dried. The city pulsed beyond the rain, alive, imperfect, forgiving. For years I had thought happiness was something you chased. Now I knew it was something that appeared when you stopped running. A few days later, Denise from the community center called to ask if I could speak to a group of women about resilience. I almost declined out of habit, then heard myself say yes. When the day arrived, I stood before them in the small auditorium, my heart drumming quietly but steadily. I told them my story, not the sanitized version, but the honest one about fear, pride, and the long climb towards self-respect. I spoke of how dignity sometimes means walking away, how strength can sound like a soft voice saying no. As I talked, faces softened. A few women nodded, others wiped their eyes. Afterward, one of them approached me, a nurse exhausted from double shifts, and said, "You made me feel like my choices aren't failures." I took her hands and answered, "They're lessons, and you're still here to use them." Walking home that evening through the mist, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if speaking the truth aloud had completed some quiet circle. That night, while preparing for bed, I thought about how every chapter of life eventually rewrites its own ending if you let it. What had begun as a confrontation over dinner had become a journey back to myself. The players had changed their lines, Ethan finding his voice, Sophie learning her worth, Victoria and Francis retreating into the echo of their wealth. But the moral had remained constant. Honesty, though costly, is the only real currency. I slipped beneath the covers and listened to the city breathe, the hum of traffic a lullaby I had finally learned to trust. In the dark, I whispered to no one in particular. I made it, and sleep gathered me gently, as if agreeing. The following morning dawned clear and sharp, the kind of autumn day that makes even the pavement sparkle. I woke before the alarm, not from anxiety, but from a subtle eagerness to meet the world. The kettle hissed, the scent of coffee filled the kitchen, and for a moment I stood barefoot by the window, just watching the city unfurl. Taxis threading through early light, a woman walking a dog that looked too dignified for its leash, steam rising from a manhole like the city's first breath. Years ago, I would have been scrolling through emails by now, chasing obligations before they could chase me. Instead, I lingered, memorizing the rhythm of an ordinary morning. The quiet joy of unhurried time felt like the truest luxury I had ever owned. After breakfast, I opened the notebook again, the one that had slowly become my mirror. The words flowed easily now, no longer explanations, but observations, about the courage of starting again, about the beauty of imperfection, about the strange grace of surviving what was meant to break you. Writing no longer felt like confession, it felt like prayer. Around noon, I wandered down to the corner market for bread and fruit, greeting neighbors by name. The grocer told me his daughter had just started college, his pride shining brighter than the apples he was stacking. We talked for a while about beginnings and goodbyes, and when I left, he slipped an extra peach into my bag. "For sweetness," he said. It struck me then how kindness rarely arrives in grand packages. It hides in gestures small enough to fit in a palm. That evening, Ethan and Sophie called from a noisy restaurant, their laughter crackling through the phone. They were planning a short trip upstate, their first real vacation together since the chaos of that night, months ago. "We'll send pictures," Ethan said. "You'll love the trees." I smiled at the thought of them surrounded by gold leaves and honest air. "Take time to rest," I told them. "Rest is a form of respect, for yourselves and for life." After the call, I sat for a while in the hush that follows love spoken aloud and realized how much of parenting is letting go, trusting that the seeds you planted will know how to find the sun. Later, as the sky bruised into twilight, I walked to the river. The water shimmered under the lamplight, each ripple catching a fragment of the city's reflection. Couples strolled hand in hand, joggers passed with rhythmic breath, and a street musician coaxed a melody from a battered violin that sounded like longing made visible. I leaned against the railing, feeling the metal cool beneath my palms, and thought about how the world keeps moving regardless of our personal revolutions. That was its mercy. It refused to pause for anyone's sorrow, forcing us to rejoin its motion or be left behind. I chose motion. I chose to keep walking, slowly but steadily, back toward the apartment that waited like an old friend. When I reached home, I left the lights off and let the city's glow pour through the windows instead. Shadows softened the furniture, and the faint hum of a passing train trembled through the floor. I realized that peace isn't a permanent state. It's a rhythm you learn to return to when the noise fades. I had learned that rhythm at last. Sitting there in the half-dark, I whispered a quiet benediction to the life I had built, messy, modest, miraculous, and felt an answering calm settle inside me like the final note of a song. Would you like me to continue straight into part 1I, carrying this same uninterrupted flow and finish the opening section? You said, 1 liter. ChatGPT said, here's part 1. L, continuing in the same elegant, reflective novel tone and seamlessly following 1H. A week later, New York began its slow shift toward winter. The air sharpened, the trees along Riverside lost their leaves in slow spirals, and the city seemed to inhale before the holidays. I found myself walking more, drawn to the rhythm of footsteps against pavement, the way strangers brushed past like brief, unfinished stories. Every corner smelled of roasted chestnuts and faint exhaust, an oddly comforting mixture that only this city could make nostalgic. Sometimes I stopped for coffee in the same tiny cafe near Columbia, where the barista with the tattoo of a compass remembered my order and asked, "Still finding your north?" I always smiled and said, "Every day." It wasn't a joke. It was the truth. Letters arrived occasionally from Ethan, short messages, sometimes a photo of Simone laughing at something off camera, sometimes a sunset from their apartment balcony. They looked lighter now, unburdened. One evening, his message ended with a line that stayed with me. "You were right, Mom. Peace doesn't come when life gets easy. It comes when you stop needing it to be." I reread those words more than once, proud and humbled all at once, the way only a mother can be. My own days had grown simple and full. I worked, I cooked, I read, I listened to old jazz records that sounded like candlelight. On Fridays, I volunteered at a literacy program downtown. Watching adults trace words they'd never learned as children moved me more than any boardroom triumph ever had. One woman, a grandmother learning to read to her grandkids, squeezed my hand after finishing her first book. "You have no idea what this means to me," she whispered. I told her quietly, "I think I do." Because I did. I understood what it meant to reclaim something you were once denied: dignity, voice, freedom. At night, the apartment felt warmer somehow, though nothing had changed but me. The same mismatched chairs, the same threadbare rug, yet everything glowed with a soft grace. That was the difference between living for display and living for peace. One required constant maintenance, the other only asked for gratitude. Sometimes before bed, I caught my reflection in the window, gray in my hair, gentleness in my eyes that hadn't been there before. Time had etched lines into my skin, but had also erased the need to apologize for who I was. And that, I realized, was its own quiet revolution. One Sunday, as I left the market with a paper bag of oranges, the same taxi driver who'd taken me home that unforgettable night recognized me. "Ma'am," he called, grinning. "Still changing the world, one conversation at a time?" I laughed. "Trying," I said. He tipped his cap. "Keep at it. The world needs more truth-tellers." As his cab pulled away, I stood there under the thin winter sun, feeling something rare: continuity. The city turned. People moved. Seasons changed. And somehow, I remained. Different, yes, but rooted in something real. I whispered to myself, "This is enough." And for the first time, the words didn't sound like surrender. They sounded like grace. Winter arrived quietly, as if the city had drawn a heavy blanket over itself. Snow fell in small, deliberate flakes that softened even the hard edges of Manhattan. From my window, the world looked gentler. Cars hummed in muffled tones. The sidewalks glittered under the streetlights, and for once, New York seemed to pause. I loved those rare silences when the noise retreated just enough for reflection to slip in. I sat by the radiator, notebook open, the steam fogging the glass, and wrote about the strange stillness that follows upheaval, the calm not of forgetfulness, but of understanding. By January, the rhythm of my days had become a kind of sanctuary. Mornings began with coffee strong enough to wake the bones, followed by a long walk to the river, where the wind carried a chill so clean it felt almost purifying. I often passed the same faces: an elderly man feeding gulls, a woman in a red scarf photographing the skyline, a boy selling hot chocolate from a thermos his father must have packed. There was comfort in the repetition. It reminded me that life goes on quietly even after it's been rearranged. Ethan called every weekend. His voice, lighter now, carried the certainty of a man who had finally chosen his own compass. He and Simone were planning to move out of their high-rise and buy a small brownstone in Brooklyn, a place they could fill with their own stories rather than inherited ones. "We're doing it our way," he said. I heard pride and a trace of wonder in his tone. "Good," I replied. "The best homes aren't built of marble. They're built of peace." He laughed softly. "I think I learned that from you." I began teaching a short seminar at the community center, Wealth Beyond Numbers. It wasn't about finance, it was about perspective. People came with notebooks and uncertainty, and we spoke about value, about purpose, about how gratitude could feel richer than any paycheck. One evening after class, a young woman lingered by the door. "Ms. Evans," she said shyly, "I came here because I thought you'd tell me how to get rich. But now I just want to learn how to be enough." Her words stayed with me all the way home. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Maybe the truest wealth is the absence of comparison." Outside, the snow thickened, swirling under the streetlights like slow-moving stars. I wrapped myself in an old shawl and watched them fall. Somewhere out there, my son was laughing with his wife. The city pulsed with its endless dreams. And I realized that life no longer felt like something to conquer. It felt like something to tend, gently, daily, with care. The woman who had once tested the world by pretending to be poor was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, wiser, rich in peace. Would you like me to continue directly into Part 2B, keeping this tone and pace as Clara's new chapter by mid-February? The days had begun to stretch, just barely, thin slices of light lingering longer on the brick walls outside my window. The snow had turned to slush, and the city's rhythm was quickening again, restless after months of hibernation. I noticed it in the way people walked, heads lifted, coats unbuttoned, eyes hungry for spring. I, too, felt that quiet stirring, that subtle urge to begin something new, though I didn't yet know what. Change, I had learned, didn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a small restlessness in your chest. One afternoon, I stopped by a secondhand bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a florist on Amsterdam Avenue. The bell above the door jingled, releasing the scent of old paper and forgotten stories. The owner, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, nodded from behind the counter. "Haven't seen you here before," he said. "First time?" "First time," I admitted, but not the last. He smiled, the sort of smile that came from understanding the quiet devotion of readers. I wandered the aisles, fingertips grazing spines like piano keys, until one title caught my eye, The Art of Enough. I bought it without reading the back. That night, I read half of it in one sitting. The author spoke of simplicity, of intention, of learning to measure a day by meaning rather than achievement. It felt less like discovery and more like recognition, as though the words were articulating what I had already begun to live. I fell asleep with the book resting on my chest and a rare feeling of alignment settling in me, like the inner and outer world had finally found their shared rhythm. The next morning, the phone rang just as the sun cut through the curtains. It was Ethan again. "Mom," he said, "Simone got accepted into an arts fellowship in Vermont." 3 months. It's a big opportunity. His excitement was tinged with something else, uncertainty. "That's wonderful," I said. "You sound unsure." He hesitated. It'll be the first time we've been apart since everything. I don't want her to think I'm upset about it." "Then tell her you're proud," I said softly. "Love doesn't shrink when it's stretched. It learns its shape." There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. "You always know what to say." "Only because I've lived long enough to learn it the hard way," I replied. After the call, I sat by the window again, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. I thought of Simone, of the courage it took to unlearn a lifetime of fear and appearance. And I thought of my son, learning to love with gentleness instead of control. I realized that my role as a mother had shifted from guiding to witnessing, from building to simply watching them build. There was an unexpected peace in that. That evening, I bundled myself in my coat and walked downtown. The city was alive with the hum of renewal. Shopkeepers sweeping stoops, streetlights flickering awake, a saxophonist playing near the subway steps. I dropped a few dollars into his open case. He looked up, smiled, and said, "You look like you've made peace with something." I chuckled. "Maybe I have." "Good," he said, adjusting his reed. "The music sounds better that way." As I walked away, the notes followed me down the street, bright and unhurried, like a promise kept. March arrived with its uncertain temperament, half frost, half promise. The days grew longer, though the wind still carried a bite sharp enough to remind you that winter wasn't done testing your patience. I loved that contradiction. It felt human, a season unsure of itself, still trying to decide who it wanted to be. That month, I began to notice the small proofs of change, a bud trembling on a bare branch in the park, a child's laughter carried by the thawing air, the way the city's gray slowly traded places with gold. Renewal was coming, not loudly, but faithfully. Ethan and Simone visited one Sunday before her departure. She wore no diamonds, no pretense, just jeans, a wool coat, and a look of genuine excitement that softened her face. Over lunch in my small apartment, we talked easily, the conversation weaving through laughter and pauses that felt full rather than strained. When Simone spoke about her fellowship, painting landscapes, learning silence, her eyes lit with something I hadn't seen before, ownership of her own story. "I'm nervous," she admitted, "but it feels like the right kind of fear." I nodded. "That's how you know you're growing." When they left, the apartment fell back into its familiar quiet. I stood at the window and watched them walk down the block, two silhouettes leaning slightly toward each other, moving at the same pace. For years, I had worried whether my son would find balance in his marriage. Now I saw he had found not balance, but partnership, a far rarer thing. I whispered a small prayer of gratitude into the still air and made tea, the kind of ritual that keeps the heart anchored. That evening, as twilight draped itself across the city, I opened my journal and wrote without planning. Maybe peace isn't something you earn, but something you finally stop resisting. The sentence startled me, not because it sounded wise, but because it felt true. All those years I had chased stability like a finish line, when all along it had been waiting for me in the pauses between battles. I poured another cup of tea, reading the line again as if it were written by someone older, kinder, and quietly certain. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived from Vermont, thick paper, Simone's handwriting looping elegantly across it. Inside was a photograph, a snowy mountain, a red cabin, and her smiling face beneath a wool hat. "The silence here is loud," she'd written, "and I'm learning to listen to it." I placed the letter on the table and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the radiator. Growth, I thought, is not always loud either. Sometimes it happens quietly, far from the people who planted the seeds. That night, I walked again to the river. The ice had broken, the water moving with new confidence. Across the Hudson, the Jersey lights shimmered like a broken necklace. I stood there breathing the cold air, thinking how life rarely gives you closure, only continuations. And maybe that was enough. I didn't need perfect endings anymore. I needed only to keep walking, to keep choosing honesty over comfort, peace over pride, and love over control. The river murmured beneath the wind, an endless conversation with the city it both bordered and embraced. I listened for a long time, then turned toward home, the faintest smile on my lips. For once, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt open. April arrived like a gentle confession, hesitant, tender, and full of promise. The city shed its gray shell almost overnight. Cherry blossoms blushed along the parkways, cafe doors swung open, and strangers began smiling again as if waking from the same long dream. I found myself smiling too, often for no reason at all. There was something intoxicating about the way light returned. It found its way through blinds, across tabletops, into the quiet corners of your heart you thought had gone dormant. One Saturday morning, as sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I froze. Standing there, clutching a bouquet of pale tulips, was Veronica, Simone's mother, the last person I had ever imagined would seek me out. For a brief second, I thought I must be dreaming. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit. Her posture no longer carried the imperious tilt I remembered from that dinner months ago. Her eyes, once sharp with judgment, seemed uncertain. "Clara," she said quietly, "may I come in?" I hesitated, only for a heartbeat, then stepped aside. "Of course." She entered slowly, her gaze flicking over my modest apartment, the mismatched chairs, the bookshelf leaning slightly, the soft clutter of an ordinary life. I could almost see her measuring it against her own immaculate world. But this time there was no disdain in her expression, only curiosity, maybe even humility. "This is lovely," she murmured, setting the tulips on the table. "Peaceful." I smiled faintly. "It is. Would you like some tea?" She nodded, and for a few minutes, silence filled the room while I boiled the water. When I returned, she was sitting at the table, hands clasped, shoulders drawn in as though bracing herself for impact. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. The words sounded strange coming from her, fragile, as if unused to forming themselves on her tongue. "I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times," she continued. "I was cruel. I was proud. I thought I was protecting my daughter, but I was really protecting my ego." I sat opposite her, letting the words hang in the air. "Why now?" I asked softly. She sighed. "Because silence has its own way of punishing you." After Simone left for Vermont, the house felt empty in a way I couldn't decorate away. Franklin refuses to talk about it, but I can't bear the weight anymore. I see now that money made me defensive. It made me believe I could purchase control, respect, love, safety. But it only bought distance. Her voice broke then, the perfect composure slipping. I saw the woman beneath the armor, not the socialite, but the mother. "Simone writes to me," she whispered. "She says she's happy. Happier than I've ever seen her, and that she learned it from you, from the way you live." She looked at me directly, eyes wet. That stung at first, but now I think it saved me. So I wanted to say thank you, and I'm sorry. For a long moment, I said nothing. I thought of the many nights I had imagined confronting her, of all the sharp words I could have used. But looking at her now, I felt none of that anger, only compassion for a woman finally facing herself. "Thank you, Veronica," I said quietly. "Apologies don't erase the past, but they open a door to something new. I accept it." Relief flickered across her face, quick, fleeting, but real. We drank our tea slowly, speaking in fragments about our children, about time, about how hard it is to unlearn old ways of living. When she stood to leave, she looked around once more and said, almost to herself, "I used to think success meant never needing anyone. Now I see it's the opposite." I smiled gently. "That's how we all start, until life teaches us otherwise." After she left, the apartment felt unusually still, the tulips glowing softly in the afternoon light. I realized that something had shifted, not just in her, but in me. Forgiveness had arrived not as an act of surrender, but as freedom. The past had finally exhaled. That evening, I wrote a single line in my notebook. "Peace expands when you make room for grace." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it completely. May came with a slow, deliberate warmth, the kind that loosens everything, the trees, the air, even the heart. The park near my building erupted in green again. The tulips Veronica had brought long since wilted, replaced by new blooms in the window box I'd planted myself. I found joy in small rhythms, watering the soil each morning, feeling the earth give beneath my fingers, watching tiny shoots reach for the sun. Renewal, I realized, rarely happens all at once. It happens quietly, insistently, the way forgiveness does. One Sunday morning, as I was reading by the window, my phone buzzed. It was Simone, her voice bright with the clarity that comes from distance and purpose. "Mother Evans," she said, a name she'd begun to use playfully, affectionately. "I have news. The residency is over. I'm coming home." I could hear wind in the background, the rustle of mountain trees. "Congratulations," I said. "How was it?" "Transformative," she replied simply. "It's strange. When you live surrounded by silence long enough, you start hearing yourself again." I painted things I didn't even know I remembered. My childhood house, my mother's hands, the ocean from our honeymoon. It's like the world stopped shouting. There was a pause, and then, softer, "I think I understand you now, and her too." I didn't press her to explain. Some truths are better left in the quiet space between words. "Then you've grown," I said. "That's all that matters." She laughed. "Grown, yes, and sunburned, but happy." After we hung up, I sat for a while watching the street below, the light bouncing off car roofs, a boy chasing his kite between the trees, and thought about how full-circle life can be. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. It returns like spring, steady and sure. A week later, there was a knock at my door again. This time, it was Franklin. His arrival startled me even more than Veronica's. He stood in the hallway holding a brown envelope, looking uneasy in his tailored suit, as if the fabric itself no longer fit. "Mrs. Evans," he began, formal out of habit. "I won't take much of your time." I opened the door wider. "You've come this far, Franklin. You might as well sit." He stepped inside, glancing around the same space his wife had once judged so harshly. "It's smaller than I remember," he said, then quickly added, "but warm. Honest." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to bring you this." He slid the envelope across the table. Inside were papers, a donation receipt made to a women's scholarship foundation in my name. "I thought," he said, avoiding my gaze, "if you could change the way my family thinks about worth, maybe I could start doing the same." His voice trembled slightly, the polish gone. "Veronica told me you forgave her. I'm not asking for the same. I'm just trying to do something good with what I have left." I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man finally stripped of pride. Not defeated, but human. "Franklin," I said, "forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened. It's about deciding not to let it define what happens next." He nodded, eyes glistening, and for a brief second, the world seemed to soften between us. Two parents who had both loved and failed in their own ways, meeting somewhere in the middle. After he left, I sat at the table staring at the envelope, feeling something uncoil deep inside me. Not triumph, not vindication, just release. It was as if a long-held tension had finally exhaled. The circle was closing, not with noise, but with peace. Later that evening, I called Simone. "Your father came by," I told her. There was silence on the line, then a slow, careful inhale. "And?" she asked. "He's trying," I said simply. "That's all any of us can do." She exhaled, and I could hear her smile through the phone. "Thank you for giving us the chance, Mother Evans. I think we're finally becoming a real family." When I hung up, the city outside was bathed in sunset. Gold poured over brick and glass, a final shimmer before night. I stood by the window, the air warm against my skin, and felt a stillness that wasn't emptiness, but arrival. For years, I had mistaken strength for solitude, pride for dignity. Now I understood. Real strength was gentleness that refused to harden, forgiveness that expected nothing in return. I turned off the lights and let the city's glow spill across my living room. It illuminated the tulip vase, the old armchair, the worn rug, each imperfect, each entirely enough. I whispered to myself, almost in prayer, "This is what wealth feels like," and the words, simple as they were, filled the room like a benediction. Summer unfolded like a long exhale. The city shimmered in heat, its skyline hazy against a pale, forgiving sky. In the evenings, when the air finally cooled, I would sit on the fire escape steps with a glass of iced tea, watching the neighborhood's soft choreography. The laughter of children running through sprinklers, the hum of a saxophone drifting from the corner bar, the occasional bark of a restless dog. After so many turbulent years, the ordinary had become extraordinary. Peace no longer felt like an absence of noise, but the quiet fullness of being alive. One July afternoon, Simone and Ethan visited again, this time with sketches and photographs from Vermont. She laid them across my table, mountains veined in lilac shadows, frozen lakes reflecting dawn, portraits of local farmers whose hands looked carved from the same soil they tilled. "They're magnificent," I told her. Simone smiled shyly. "I want to exhibit them. But not in a gallery that sells for show. Somewhere honest. Maybe a community space. Free entry. Donations to the scholarship foundation your name is on." I felt my throat tighten. That sounds perfect. Later, as she packed her drawings back into a leather portfolio, Ethan wandered to the window. "You know, Mom," he said quietly, "this place still feels like home. Every time I walk in here, I remember who I am." I met his eyes and saw the man he'd become. Steady, unpretentious, certain of his own compass. "That's the best compliment you could ever give me," I replied. After they left, I found myself thinking of my own mother. The woman who had taught me that dignity had nothing to do with possessions. That kindness was a language you spoke with your actions, not your bank account. I hoped she would be proud. I hoped I had carried her lessons far enough to hand them forward. Autumn arrived early that year. The air sharpened. The trees on Riverside Drive caught fire in shades of amber and crimson. The art show took place in an old renovated library downtown. The walls were simple white, the floors creaked, and the air smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. People came, students, neighbors, strangers who'd read about the event in the local paper. I watched as they stood before Simone's paintings, silent, moved. Near the entrance, a modest plaque read, "To Clara Evans," who reminded us that honesty is the highest form of art. For a moment, I had to steady myself. Simone squeezed my hand and whispered, "You taught me everything that matters." I smiled through tears. "No," I said, "you just remembered what was already inside you." When the evening ended, Franklin and Veronica appeared at the door. They looked older, their edges worn by time and humility. Veronica approached slowly, a hesitant softness in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. "All of it." I nodded, accepting the olive branch without ceremony. Some reconciliations need no words, only presence. The four of us stood together, briefly, beneath the gentle hum of conversation and jazz. Not a perfect family, but a real one. That night, walking home under the golden lamplight, I felt the city breathing around me. Taxis gliding like yellow fish, leaves spinning in slow descent, a distant siren threading through the air. I thought about all the versions of myself I had been, the ambitious executive, the weary mother, the woman defending her dignity at a dinner table. They all lived within me still, harmonized now, no longer at war. I had spent so many years proving I was enough. Now I simply knew it. At home, I brewed chamomile tea and opened the window wide. The night air carried a hint of the river, metallic, alive. I took out my journal one last time and wrote, "True wealth is measured in quiet mornings, in peace that needs no witness, in the courage to stay kind." I closed the notebook, placed it beside the tulip vase, and let the silence settle. In that stillness, I felt everything, the ache of what was lost, the grace of what remained, and the steady, luminous truth of who I had become. Outside, New York glittered, restless, eternal, yet for the first time, it seemed to pause with me. And I, Clara Evans, sat within its vastness, utterly content, rich beyond measure, finally home.